If you've come across this video, it's probably because you've seen, or at least heard about, the series Mary and George. It tells the story of Mary Villiers and her son George, who used their charms to seduce King James I of England and gain power at court. But the series only shows a small part of a much more complex and fascinating story. So let's dive into the real life of King James I, one of the most interesting and scandalous monarchs in British history. Let's start from the beginning, shall we? James had quite a dramatic start in life. He was born in 1566 at Edinburgh Castle, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, and her second husband, Lord Darnley. The relationship between his parents was complicated, to say the least. Typical parents who fight all the time. Apparently, Darnley was very focused on his political ambition, while Mary was the target of rumors about possible infidelity. It was a complicated situation. Divorce was not an option at that time. Not even the arrival of little James could bring family happiness. When he was only 8 months old, his father was murdered under mysterious circumstances, and his mother was suspected of being involved. A year later, Mary was forced to abdicate the throne in favor of her son. So, at the tender age of 13 months, James Charles Stuart became King James VI of Scotland. James spent his childhood and adolescence under the tutelage of several regents, while his mother remained imprisoned in England. Of course, this was not an easy time for the young king. Scotland was divided by religious and political conflicts, and James had to learn to navigate those turbulent waters from an early age. But he also developed a great interest in theology and became a consummate scholar. In fact, later in life, he would oversee the translation of the famous King James Bible. But that's not the matter that interests us at the moment, right? Now, the series Mary and George focuses on the rise of George Villiers, a man who didn't have a penny to his name but had a great ambition to enter the power scene. And he did, thanks to James. But how was this possible? Well, for that, we need to understand a bit more about the life of the king. James was growing up under the teachings that one day he would sit on the Edinburgh throne, but besides the afternoons filled with diplomacy and good manners, he also enjoyed spending some time with distinguished company. Strangely, at least what was strange for the time, the majority of these companions were male. His first favorite that we know of was Esme Stuart, Lord d'Aubigny, his second cousin, who arrived at the Scottish court in 1579 when James was just 13 years old. But that didn't stop the young king from being immediately fascinated by this sophisticated 37-year-old man. Obviously, this relationship caused a great scandal at court. Observers of the time said that James was so in love that, in public, he often threw his arms around his neck and kissed him. For everyone at court, what was happening there was more than evident. But the controversy arose not so much because of the homosexual nature of the relationship, but because of the political and religious implications. You see, Esme was Catholic, and it was feared that he might influence the young Protestant king. Finally, pressure from Protestant nobles forced Esme to return to France, where he died shortly after. James was devastated and wrote poetry lamenting the loss of his beloved. Despite this heartbreak, James ended up marrying a woman, Anne of Denmark, an arranged marriage, obviously. She was 14 years old, and he was 23. They even had several children, including the future King Charles I. But here's where things get interesting. Despite his marriage, James had a clear preference for men. In fact, his relationships with men became even more notorious after his ascent to the English throne in 1603. When Queen Elizabeth I died without heirs in 1603, James, as her closest relative, became King of England, thus uniting the crowns of England and Scotland. This event marked the beginning of what would be known as the Union of the Crowns. As King of England, James might have thought he now had more power than ever to do as he pleased. So throughout his reign, he had a series of male favorites whom he showered with attention, titles, and gifts. Among the most notable were Robert Carr, and of course George Villiers, whom we see in the series. To understand the opportunity the Villiers saw to win over the king, let's look at the best example, his relationship with Robert Carr. He arrived at court in 1607, and as soon as he did, James had his eyes on him. It's said that the king was captivated by Carr's beauty and elevated him to positions of power, naming him Viscount of Rochester in 1611. But Carr made a terrible mistake that ended their relationship: a scandal. If the crown was already mired in gossip and rumors, another scandal was the last thing needed, right? Carr became embroiled in a murder case related to his marriage to Frances Howard, which led the king to strip him of all granted favors. This is where George Villiers comes into the picture, shrewd and with a mother who would do anything to achieve her goal. Villiers arrived at court in 1614, when James was already King of England. George was young, handsome, and charming, and he quickly caught the king's attention. Maybe not as handsome as Nicholas Galitzine, but he was quite good-looking. The series shows how Mary Villiers, George's mother, pushed him to seduce the king. She worked hard to gather enough money to make him a decent opportunity within the English court. According to Godfrey Goodman, who later became the Bishop of Gloucester, when he saw George, he said he was the handsomest bodied man in England. His limbs were so well compacted, with such an agreeable conversation and so sweet a disposition. Well, he had the whole package, right? Now, while it's true that Mary was an ambitious woman seeking to improve her family's position by getting the king to notice George, the relationship between the two seems to have been genuine on both sides. James was completely captivated by George, whom he affectionately called Steenie, a nickname derived from Stephen because, according to the king, George resembled a painting of Saint Stephen. Mary's plan worked perfectly. George's rise at court was meteoric. In a matter of years, he went from being a mere knight to becoming the Duke of Buckingham, one of the highest titles in English nobility. The king wrote him passionate letters, showered him with gifts, and entrusted him with state matters. This relationship was notoriously physical, and James made no effort to hide his affection in public. On one occasion, during a dinner, James declared before his council, "Christ had his John, and I have my George." The relationship between James and George caused considerable controversy at court. Many nobles resented the influence George had over the king and accused him of corruption and abuse of power. And they weren't entirely wrong. George took advantage of his position to enrich himself and place his family and friends in important positions. Who knows if George truly loved James, but there is evidence that the king was completely smitten with him. For example, in a letter from 1623, James speaks of their relationship as a marriage and refers to George as his wife. "I cannot content myself without sending you this gift, praying to God that I may have a happy and comfortable meeting with you and that we may propose a new marriage this Christmas that may be maintained in the future. I only wish to live in this world for your sake and would rather live exiled anywhere on earth with you than live a sad widow's life without you. May God bless you, my sweet child and wife, and may you be a comfort to your dear father and husband." And I know I said it's hard to tell if George felt the same, but guess what he responded to this declaration of love from James? He didn't hold back on the sappiness and wrote things like, "I have such love for your person and adoration for every one of your other parts that it is much more than any man ever had. I only wish to live in this world for you, and I will live and die loving you." To top it off, this Duke of Buckingham commissioned portraits where he appeared completely shaved, showing off slender, stylish legs for the picture. Now you can say that even in the 1600s, they sent daring portraits. As for Mary, she also took advantage of the new momentum. In 1618, she became Countess of Buckingham and spent much time at court, keeping company with her son-in-law. The bond they built was such that James declared that his only purpose in life was to advance the Villiers family. Despite the criticisms of everyone else, James remained loyal to George until the end of his life. He even introduced him to his son and heir, Prince Charles, the future Charles I, as his friend and adoptive father. Charles and George developed a close friendship that continued even after James's death. Speaking of James's death, it occurred in 1625 when the king was 58 years old. By then, his health had declined considerably due to years of excess in food and drink. Years earlier, his wife, Queen Anne, had also died, and although it was purely a political marriage, they had managed to build a close, affectionate relationship over time. She was like his best friend, and her departure deeply affected him. To fill this emotional void, George remained by his side until the end, caring for and consoling him. He assumed the role of caregiver, lover, and political advisor. After James's death, George maintained his influence at court thanks to his friendship with Charles Thurse. However, his unpopularity among the nobility and the people continued to grow. Finally, in 1628, George was assassinated by an army officer named John Felton, who was discontented with all the abuse of power happening. His death marked the end of an era in the English court. It was also a blow to King Charles I, who had grown very fond of him. So what can we say about the legacy of James I? The series Mary and George primarily presents him as a weak and easily manipulated monarch, obsessed with his male favorites. While it's true that his relationships caused scandal and controversy, reducing his entire reign to that would be unfair. James was a complex and intellectual ruler. During his reign, England enjoyed a long period of peace, although religious tensions continued to bubble beneath the surface. He was a great patron of the arts and literature. Shakespeare and his theater company performed under his patronage. As for his sexuality, well, it's important to understand it in the context of his time. James was neither the first nor the last monarch to have same-sex favorites. What made him stand out was how open he was about it, and the degree of influence he allowed his favorites. But in retrospect, it's fascinating to think that 400 years ago, England had a queer king. And that's the real story behind Mary and George. If you enjoyed this video, let me know in the comments and by hitting the like button. Subscribe and activate the notification bell. See you in the next video.